Morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today?
Good morning, Frank. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
I've been, my attention in the last week or so has been taken very much with what's going on with abortion legislation. And it occurred to me that, well, I'm always thinking of this actually, that in my lifetime, the global population has tripled. And as this has been happening, so many things that have to do with the meaning of everyday life have changed.
Hmm.
Presumably, there must be some relationship. The first thing is, of course, that gender relations are so completely different now from what they used to be. But back in the middle of the last century, we had no questions about what was life and what was death, and what you could do about it. And we had no questions about the importance of the distinction between male and female. And now everything in relation to those two factors has changed. I mean, first, of course, I remember in the 1950s, women started wearing pants, which was revolutionary at the time. And now we've got to the point where you choose whether you want to be a man or a woman. But abortion was illegal, and nobody questioned the fact that human life belonged to God, so you didn't interfere with it. And then we had Roe versus Wade in 1973, and everything worked very well until recently, 50 years later, over 50 years later, everybody's going back on that decision. And obviously, there's a relationship between what's happening about the choice one has to make between life and death on the one hand, and gender relations on the other, although they're independent variables, because apart from the fact that abortion relates to women's rights, you can now choose whether you want to live or die, and you can, if you decide you've had enough of life, you can go to particular places and have your life terminated. That would have been absolutely unthinkable 50 years ago.
Yes, it would have been.
On the one hand, more and more states of the United States, I don't think this is happening in Europe anywhere, are legislating against abortion. On the other hand, there is a lot of killing going on that didn't used to happen.
Are you saying killing equating to abortion?
No, killing in relation to what we used to call murder.
I see. Right.
I mean, apart from the fact that the police kill people, which they've always been able to do, but didn't used to do. And recently, just the other day, a policeman was jailed for shooting and killing a woman who was just walking towards him.
I read that.
Whereas, I mean, if I had done that outside my own house, I would have been facing capital punishment, I think. And then this morning in the news, a person it was decided not to charge a person with any sort of crime who had, when somebody intruded into his house, he had shot them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these things would not be taken lightly 50 years ago. And then the school shootings that we've been experiencing over the years, in the last 15 years? I can't remember when the first one began. They're now the schools are functioning as a sort of inspiration to people who think that's a great idea. Why don't I do it?
Right.
And they're now beginning to demolish the schools where it's happened, so they won't be tourist attractions.
That's right. They are. Yeah.
I mean, all this sort of thing is so new.
Well, this is
so different.
But this
what
is
we were used to before.
this could be the reverse side of the coin that I was having dinner the other night with friends here in the United States, and we were talking about the age cohort of people, say in their early 30s and late 20s, and in the United States. And these people are gender blind, they are color blind, they are religion blind. Um, it's in one way, it's very liberating and heartening, um, because these are the people who are going to be on the ascendancy population wise as the baby boomers begin to die out. Um, and
Was it called Generation X?
it's probably Generation X. It's probably the millennials. It's
Uh,
this conflation of all of those named generations, wherever they may be. And if you think for a minute as to why that is the case, why these people are so socialized and accepting against things that 50 years ago would have been anathema, you can point to a number of different reasons. I mean, we talk about them every week: the intensified globalization, people becoming both inured to these kinds of changes because they're so familiar to them, and then also perhaps recognizing that they're not as threatening to them as they might have seemed to us 50, 60, 70 years ago. Um, but on the flip side of that are the things that you're talking about. There's this intensified kind of desire to have the freedom to end one's life if one is in extreme pain. There's the acceptance of uh, bad apples, if you will, in this population pool who might go buy a gun and might go terrorize a school and engage in extreme violence. So I'm not so sure that we can divorce the bad from the good. And I don't know how other societies have handled that in the past during periods of great change, but I'm sure there's precedent for it somewhere.
well, it's interesting that even though the global population has tripled in this period, it's grown much more in some parts of the world than others.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, am I right that the population of the United States has doubled in that period?
Yes, yes, it's
Um,
335 million now, and back then, I think at the end of World War II, I don't think it was 170.
no. And yet in England, the population is almost the same now, only a little bit more than it was in the middle of the last century.
A lot of the American population growth could be due to immigration.
Yeah. Um, and that, of course, would make any problems due to numbers of people much more difficult in this country than in, for example, England.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the case that we find this sort of thing happening much more here than we do in England, and more here than in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
even though Europe has a big immigration problem, but it's not something that takes its own course without, well, of course, now we're trying to stop the immigration on the southern border. But so I think the interesting question is the relationship to globalization. And after all, globalization is increasing numbers of people with very different backgrounds and experience being in interaction with each other. And that's happening much more in some parts of the world than others. And there are certainly much bigger problems in some parts of the world than others. So is this a reason to be pessimistic about the long-term consequences of globalization, or is it, as I've argued elsewhere, a difficult period that we're going through now, but it will take a few more decades before we get through this, and after that, everything will be okay?
I'm inclined to agree with the latter interpretation because I think, for example, starting with the abortion discussion, which is what you led off with, I believe that the anti-abortion thrust that's going on now is distinctly in the minority insofar as the preference of American voters. And I do think that over time, perhaps a short amount of time, um, that that's going to evaporate. I do think that people,
Well,
women and younger people in particular, just are not going to accept that.
one would think that it has to be a minority, but the puzzle is that it's getting legislated so easily.
Well, it's being legislated in unusual places. Let's keep that in mind. In very
But quite a
conservative,
number of states.
in very
Uh,
conservative states, in very conservative states
yeah,
where evangelical movements are able to do what they need to do in advance of primary seasons to make sure that they don't have challenges from the right. I mean, you know the story as well as I do. But the point is, the key, of course, is the Supreme Court. And one more justice passes away and a conservative is appointed, then Roe v. Wade is going to be seriously threatened. And then it's going to become very difficult because what will have to happen is it's going to take a legislative change in order to change both the presidency and the Senate in order then to wait for vacancies to open up on the Supreme Court in order to reverse the challenge against Roe v. Wade. So, I mean, it's going to take some time, God forbid, if all of those things come to pass.
and Ruth Bader Ginsburg last night in a talk she was giving said that there's going to be, more or less said there's going to be some violent disagreements on the Supreme Court. She didn't say in relation to what, but
Well, there will be, but see, after should she pass away, then it's sort of a moot point, all right? Because
yeah.
right now the Chief Justice can act as the swing vote, and he does seem to be somebody who stands on legal precedent, very much so. So I think for the time being, the composition of the court will keep Roe v. Wade intact. But if we lose one more of the liberal justices and he or she is replaced by a conservative, then the role that Roberts would play is no longer relevant. He'll be outvoted.
Yeah.
So, and then it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time because those guys on the court are young.
Yes. And we have, of course, the same problem of that we've talked about before, democracy not working quite the same way now as it used to, and whether the current president will be elected for another term and have an opportunity to appoint yet another Supreme Court justice or not.
Well, it's interesting because as you know, I just came back from the United Kingdom for 5 nights, and people over there are they're as sickened of their political scene as we are of our own. It's really it's almost a sense of despair. And the one thing that I was surprised about is that there's a universal acceptance that Brexit is going to happen, no matter what. This idea of the redo of the plebiscite is not realistic, apparently. And they're going to leave the EU. It's most likely going to be in a format similar to what Norway has, so they can still remain in the economic union and the customs union. But they're definitely going out. And I think the recognition further is they can't crash out. They recognize that the economic damage that's going to cause is simply too much.
Yeah. No, it's amazing that two-party systems seem not to be working anymore because up until not that long ago, if you belong to a party, everybody in the party agreed with each other about the way you should be voting in the assembly, and that doesn't work anymore. So that the party system isn't working, not really working here, and it's certainly not working in England.
It's not working, and if you look at the alternative, whether it be Putin's Russia or the Xi Jinping's President Xi's China, that's not quite working so well either. So
No.
it's really it's a challenge now as to how institutions of government are going to respond to the increasing population that is increasingly connected to each other. And there's no viable model out there that I know of. It's just, I don't know what the answer is.
No, we certainly are in a stage now of globalization that I think is resulting from the rate of population growth and movement, where we need political innovation because we have to have ways of making things work politically that involve larger numbers of people than the nation state that we've been used to for the last few centuries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that seems not to have been understood yet, or at least so far as we know, nothing really significant is happening.
I overheard briefly on a British interview. It must have been the BBC one early in the morning. And they were recapping the D-Day observances, and they had some professor from somewhere on, and he was talking about how he was talking about the nation state. He was giving a background primer on World War II to people who, the viewers presumably, who might not have known anything about World War II, which was incomprehensible to me. And he was talking about the nation state. And he said, for the past X hundred years, we've had nation states. And now maybe in the next 20 or 50 years, we won't have them any longer. And I had it on in the background, I was brushing my teeth. I stopped and I walked back out of the bathroom and looked at the TV. And this is the first time I've ever heard this, that the prospect that 50 years from now, there may not be a nation state system. So if it's being talked about on the BBC at 6:30 in the morning, and we always talk about it, we may be nearer to the truth than we might think.
That's amusing because of what's just been happening between Trump and Queen Elizabeth II. And a colleague of mine in the Wharton School has just published a paper saying how useful monarchies are where they still exist. It's amusing that we've got this enormous landmass from France to China, and a little island on one side and another little island on the other side, and they both have monarchies.
The royal family achieved many compliments last week from everybody that I heard. They held their nose and did their job. They were received very well. So even as Americans, that kind of constancy was very impressive.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Brian.
Okay.
Pleasure as always, and we'll look forward
next week.
to reconvening next week. Thank you.